In this panel, we have 4 experts on the realities of workers and consumers, from farm workers to union employees to government scientists to the consumers. And we have the treat of hearing from them what the realities are for whistleblowing on the ground and what changes we need to make sure that whistleblowing continues to be protected and or begins to be protected, as the case may be, and we ensure a safe food supply. We have more extensive biographies in the materials, so I'll just briefly introduce the panelists. To my immediate right is Celia Wexler. Celia is the Washington representative for the Scientific Integrity Program of the Union of Concerned Scientists. She advocates for legislative and regulatory reforms that ensure that federal policymakers can rely on unbiased science and that federal scientists can tell the truth and keep their jobs. To the right of Celia is Tony Corbo. Tony's the senior lobbyist for the food campaign at Food and Water Watch and is responsible for food-related legislative and regulatory issues that come before Congress and the executive branch. And Food and Water Watch is a nonprofit that advocates for common sense policies that will result in healthy, safe food and access to safe and affordable drinking water. To the right of Tony is Bruce Goldstein. Bruce is the president of Farm Worker Justice, a national advocacy, litigation, and educational organization for migrant and seasonal farm workers. And Bruce has engaged in a whole range of activities towards advancing that mission, from litigation against the government and private employers to advocacy in front of administrative agencies to training the next generations of paralegals and lawyers. And then finally, we have Miranda Nelson on the end of the panel. Miranda is with the United Food and Commercial Workers, and is an expert on the research looking at the link between the relationship between food safety and unionization. Celia, would you like to start?
Okay, what I always ask is not can you hear me, but can you see me? Does this thing go adjust? All right, so I think, yeah. It's been a long day, and I know you are all, as we are, probably looking forward to the reception. So I'll try to make this presentation as painless and as informative as possible, and I want to thank our analyst, Heidi Moline, for assisting me, since this is the first time I've used PowerPoint. The people who are in the government's food safety front lines often often find themselves buffeted by external forces, prying members of Congress and the food industry, among others. That external influence, our food safety scientists tell us, often leads to weaker rules and less protection for American families. Now, the Food Safety Modernization Act will strengthen our system of food safety, but this law alone will not address a major problem that federal food safety inspectors and scientists face on a daily basis: political and corporate interference in their work. You know, they are not the poor tomato growers who are in the fields and literally are suffering physical problems, but these are people who want to tell the truth and do their job, and they're often stymied at every turn. This sentiment was extracted from several hundred essays from FDA and USDA scientists and food safety inspectors whom we surveyed last year, and it wasn't unusual. Another USDA employee wrote, "Corporations have far too much influence in all areas of government, including this agency." Another wrote, "Food safety is being compromised by business and political influence and lack of thorough science-based decisions." More than 1,700 FDA and USDA employees responded to our 44 question survey. Yeah, it was not 1,700 questions. And hundreds of them reported that their work frequently was subject to outside pressure. More than half of our respondents said that their agencies gave too much weight to business interests when making policy decisions. A quarter said that food companies were able to get their respective agencies to withdraw or modify an agency policy or action that was supposed to protect public health and consumers. 24% said that they personally experienced situations where members of Congress were able to intervene and get an agency policy or action designed to protect the public weakened or modified. And 10% of respondents had been asked by their bosses to exclude or alter technical information or conclusions in an agency scientific document, changes they felt were inappropriate. In all, a third of our respondents told us that they had personally experienced some type of political interference in their work during the past year. So even though we have a different administration, this problem doesn't completely go away. Ensuring that our food is safe is a complex process that must be rooted in facts and unbiased science. Now, you've spent a lot of time today learning about the new law, but the law alone won't change the culture at both FDA and USDA, the culture that makes it difficult for scientists and other food safety workers to do their work without interference and to make sure that science underlies agency actions to protect the public from tainted food. Those who work at the FDA and USDA must work for agencies that respect them, that listen to them, and encourage them to speak up when they feel that outside pressure is weakening our food safety defenses. Certainly, it's a good thing that a new administration has come on board. Things have changed at the top when it comes to respecting science and its crucial importance to public health and safety, including food safety. And we at the Union of Concerned Scientists were watching the president during his inaugural and during his address, he said that he pledged to restore science to its rightful place. Last December, the administration made another very important positive step when they released a scientific integrity directive that reinforced what the president said about protecting science. The directive notes that, quote, science and public trust in science thrives in an environment that shields scientific data and analyses from inappropriate political influence. And the directive is really a kind of roadmap to agencies to ensure that scientists and agency employees, including those working on food safety, are protected from interference. So that roadmap, first of all, rests on transparency. The more openly, and yeah, that's our transparent, that's a glass frog, in case you wonder where the transparency comes. The more openly the FDA and USDA operate, the harder it is for special interests to exert undue influence on them. The directive requires agencies to find ways to make scientific and technical information more accessible to the public. It asks agencies to have media policies in place that give scientists the freedom to speak directly to reporters about their work. And it makes clear that no public affairs official may ask a scientist to alter his or her scientific findings. But also crucial to ensuring food safety is addressing more head-on the problem of special interest influence. And so the directive asks agencies to be on the alert for conflicts of interest. Advisory panels for FDA and USDA, for example, are required to be staffed as much as possible by experts who don't have financial ties to the industry these agencies regulate. An overwhelming number of our respondents, about 70%, also believed that whistleblower protections for both public and private sector workers would enhance food safety. Now, when the Scientific Integrity Directive was released in December, UCS and GAP both had high hopes that before the end of last year, Congress would approve a comprehensive whistleblower law for all federal workers, including federal scientists. The administration, too, felt that a federal whistleblower law was on the way, and for that reason, the Scientific Integrity Directive didn't talk about whistleblower protections. But as we all know, the 111th Congress failed to deliver. big time. So UCS will be urging agencies, including FDA and USDA, to adopt strong implementation plans that include not only transparency and accountability, but also make clear that agency employees who raise concerns about their mission-driven work should not be punished. And we will be strongly going from agency to agency and urging both the FDA and USDA to put into place policies that emphasize transparency, accountability, and create a culture that celebrates rather than punishes whistleblowers. These are the ingredients that will create a truly healthy food supply for all of us. And we urge you all to work with us on that. You can go to our website to see what we've done. It's ucsusa.org. And thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much for your remarks, Celia. Next is going to be Tony Corbo.
I want to thank GAP very much for holding this annual conference. It winds up being a highlight of my year coming here. Before I went to work on food safety issues, I was a union representative for about 20 years, and primarily representing public employees. And I find the provisions in the new FDA Food Safety Modernization Act as it deals with whistleblowers to be very significant. The question is going to be how the agency is going to go about implementing those provisions, making sure their employees understand what their rights are, and what the industry does in terms of explaining the rights of their workers under the Act. If I were doing this, I would require that a poster go up that is prominently displayed, both at FDA offices and every workplace that FDA has jurisdiction over, that explains the rights of the employees, just like you see in your offices now. What the minimum wage law is, what your rights are under workers' comp, but I think this is going to be a significant piece of the legislation that needs to be explained very carefully, and so that employees can afford their rights under the Act. And GAP should be complimented for their work on this provision. As Celia just said, there's got to be a culture established in the workplaces for whistleblowers to come forward and be protected in their rights to alert their supervisors as far as unsafe practices. My work has been primarily with USDA employees, with the USDA inspectors. It was funny, right before I came here, I got a phone call from New Zealand, from the Public Service Association in New Zealand that represents the meat inspectors there. The government there is attempting to gut the inspection system and turn over more of the responsibility over to company employees to do the inspection of meat products. And about 4 months ago, one of the line inspectors started to articulate publicly his concerns over the industry essentially policing itself. And as a consequence, the New Zealand government put a gag order on this individual. And so since then, he's been communicating his concerns through his union, and so I constantly get phone calls from his union rep in terms of what's going on. So the issue of whistleblowers and governments coming down or companies coming down on their employees is a global issue. And New Zealand is, while it may be a small country, it ranks in the top 10 in terms of meat exports to the United States. So it does have the food safety implications here in this country. And Tom Devine, I mean, this is bringing up, you know, memories for Tom, because he was about 11, 12 years ago, you were working on a similar issue involving Australia, where they were trying to privatize their inspection system. And so the thing is that the issue of whistleblower rights is a global one. And as our food system becomes more and more globalized, we need those folks to be able to come forward if food safety is being compromised. As I said, most of my work has been with USDA inspectors. GAP did a lot of pioneer work representing USDA inspectors who were coming forward when USDA was attempting to change their inspection practices and how food safety was being compromised. And GAP represented a number of USDA inspectors over the years who suffered the consequences of coming forward. Wanted to share an experience with you that still has implications for the way inspectors are treated at USDA and their ability to come forward with problems with food safety. In December 23rd, 2003, the cow that stole Christmas. We had a cow, the first cow in the United States that was diagnosed with mad cow disease. And so right after that, in early January, the USDA published an interim rule that essentially said that any cow over 30 months, the plants would have to remove the central nervous system from those cows. The science showed that cows over 30 months are more likely to exhibit the symptoms of mad cow disease. And the central nervous system is where the disease manifests itself. So USDA said, okay, so any cow that is over 30 months that's slaughtered, the central nervous system has to come out. What USDA did was essentially place that responsibility on the companies. It wasn't something that the USDA inspectors had hands-on responsibility for. Starting in the summer of 2004, the head of the inspectors union at USDA started to receive reports from some of its inspectors that the company employees were not adhering to the new regulations. So when he accumulated a number of complaints from his membership, in December of 2004 sent a letter to his boss at USDA headquarters saying, look, we're getting reports that the company employees are not adhering to the new regulations. Why don't you let us handle some of those procedures directly? And so a number of weeks went by. He did not get a response from his boss at USDA headquarters. So Stan Painter, the head of the inspectors union, went public and said the companies are not following the new regulations. Instead of investigating whether his allegations were true, USDA decided to investigate Stan. Had him come into Washington, subjected him to 7 hours of interrogation, wanting the names of the inspectors who were giving him this information. When he refused to divulge that information, then the USDA called all of his regional presidents, the regional officers of the union, into Washington for another days of interrogation. And when they wouldn't divulge the names, the USDA put Stan under investigation to the extent that they also wanted the USDA Inspector General to conduct criminal investigation into Stan. And as you recall, back in 2003, when the mad cow incident occurred, virtually all of our beef exports stopped. Countries would not accept our beef because of the incidents of the mad cow incident. Japan was our biggest export market. Because of Stan Painter's allegations that the procedures weren't being followed, the Japanese government started to ask USDA what was being done about the union's allegations. And what USDA did was post on the embassy website in Tokyo a bunch of derogatory information about Mr. Painter, including that they wanted to launch a criminal investigation into Mr. Painter. Both GAP and Food and Water Watch filed a Freedom of Information Act request to gather any non-compliance reports. These are the reports that the inspectors write up when violations occur, regulations, to prove that Mr. Painter's allegations were accurate. That Freedom of Information Act request went into USDA in December 2004. After congressional hearings that protested USDA's actions against Mr. Painter, consumer groups writing into USDA protesting the way Mr. Painter was being treated, in August of 2005, the Freedom of Information Act request response came, and sure enough, there were 114 instances that proved that Mr. Painter's allegations were true. And it wasn't until that day that they stopped their investigation into Mr. Painter. Now, what did that do? Even though that incident happened 6 years ago, to this day, you still hear inspectors say, well, I'm not going to put my job on the line because if they could do that to the union president, what are they going to do, to me? And it has poisoned the labor relations at USDA with their inspectors union, and they've had to bring in facilitators to try to smooth over the relationship. But it is still something, at least with this generation of USDA inspectors, that still remains in their minds. We at Food and Water Watch in 2007 did our own survey of USDA inspectors. We managed to get the addresses to some 5,600 USDA inspectors, and 1,320 of them responded. And it was interesting. We asked a couple of questions. One that were pretty revealing. One question asked, within the last year, have any plant employees tipped you off about adulteration or a violation of the regulations because they felt they could not get the plant to correct the problem or were afraid that they would get in trouble if they tried? 81% of the inspectors said yes. So plant employees who tried to get their management to correct a food safety issue were afraid to bring it up to their management, instead decided to bring it up to the USDA inspector. And then we asked the question, within the last 5 years, has FSIS or any of your supervisors issued or changed a rule that you believe puts the public at increased danger from meat and poultry products? 51% said yes. And so the thing is that a culture has to be created for government employees, for plant employees, to be able to come forward whenever there is danger to the public. And it's still not there. It's still, at least at USDA, it's still not there. And so that needs to be corrected. Just to finish up, this Monday, USDA put out a notice to its employees, to the FSIS inspectors, that if an inspector thinks that line speeds are going too fast for food safety concerns or for worker safety concerns, they are to bring those issues up to their supervisor to either to slow down the line or to stop the line. This is an issue that we've been working with the food and commercial workers on. Now, the one and that's great. I mean, we've been concerned about line speeds. In some of these poultry plants, they're running those lines at 180 birds per minute. They're slaughtering poultry at 180 birds per minute. In some of the beef processing facilities, 360 head of cattle are being processed every hour. And so inspectors have complained that either they cannot really do their jobs as inspectors, or where they see potential contamination, they are unable to stop that line in order to deal with any contamination. And that's great that USDA has finally recognized the issue of line speeds. The one thing that is missing is that what happens when that inspector brings it up to his supervisor. If the supervisor doesn't take action, is there any way for that inspector to be able to document that? And that's what's missing. And so we're going to be watching this issue very, very carefully because of the fact that this is a very important issue. The industrialized food safety system, the food system in this country is essentially being deregulated because of the big corporations, and this is an issue from a food safety standpoint, from a worker safety standpoint, that needs to be addressed. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Tony. Now Bruce Goldstein is going to tell us about the reality of whistleblower protection for the real first line of food safety, our farm workers.
Thank you very much. Thanks for hanging around late on Friday. Farm Worker Justice is a national advocacy group. We engage in advocacy in Congress and administrative agencies. We do litigation around the country. We educate farm workers how to control their own destinies. We train them how to set up safety and health programs in their communities, and we support the efforts of farm worker organizations around the country to organize and empower farm workers to improve their own wages and working conditions, their health, and their communities. There are something like, we don't know how many farm workers there are in this country, because nobody counts them, because the resources are not assigned to do that. But there's probably around 2 million farm workers in this country, not including their immediate family members, which are probably about another 2 million, but again, we really don't know. About 80% or more of farm workers are immigrants. They were born in a foreign country. More than half of farm workers lack authorized immigration status. They generally earn, on average, they earn between $15,000 and $17,000 a year. But that includes a lot of kind of high-end farm workers. A lot of farm workers earn between, give or take, around $10,000 a year. The conditions for farm workers really are pretty poor and pretty backwards for a variety of reasons. One is that through the magic of immigration policy for about 300 years, we have disempowered farm workers. They come here in a status that really makes them very vulnerable and denies them bargaining power vis-a-vis their employers and as well as the government. So what have we done recently? Well, recently we basically created immigration laws and rules, and then we don't enforce them. And we effectively invite farm workers from people from other countries to come into this country, but not have a legal immigration status. So they are here kind of in a very vulnerable status where they're fearful of what will happen to them if they are found out. We have a broken immigration system. Our organization, like many others, has been working for a number of years on a compromise with agribusiness to fix this broken immigration system. It's so broken and so ludicrous that even we agree on a solution with the grower groups. But even that is too much to ask for Congress. And so more than half the farm workers in the country are undocumented. In some local areas, you're talking 90% of the farm workers lacking authorized immigration status. So what happens? Well, very often they are really afraid to come forward and complain about anything, to tell their employer that they want better wages and working conditions, or to tell the government to come in and enforce the limited rights that they have. So there are organizations like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the United Farm Workers, Farm Labor Organizing Committee, PACUN up in Oregon, and others that are mobilizing farm workers and giving them a voice and empowering them to demand better things from their employers and their communities and the government. But the truth is that only a very small percentage of farm workers in this country are organized. So the idea that farm workers will come forward and be whistleblowers, well, it's just very difficult. I'm a lawyer. I'm a labor lawyer by training. Now they have me doing this administrative stuff, but I love to file lawsuits for workers in court. But it's very, very difficult to convince farm workers to step forward and file a lawsuit, even when there are egregious violations, because they just feel like they're going to be found out, they're going to be fired, and they're going to be deported. And even if they're here illegally, they know plenty of people who are not, and they're afraid for their friends and family members who could be deported. So they're here to make money, to work hard, to support their families. Okay, if they're not getting the minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, they're making $5 an hour. Well, you know, what do we say about that? Well, we say, well, that's better than they make in their home country, right? So if that's the measure by which we decide things, well, then it is better. But of course, it's a totally inappropriate response. There are massive violations of farm workers' rights in this country. You go anywhere and talk to farm workers, it's the most amazing thing. You know, I've been in vineyards where they make, I like wine. I've been in a couple of vineyards where they make really good wine. I mean, stuff that I really can't afford, and by far, but would love to drink. And you talk to the workers there and you figure, okay, these are going to be like the most stable workers in the country, right? Because they're making loads of money selling bottles, $45 to $150 a bottle. They can afford to pay these workers, give them health care, give them a retirement plan, and you know, treat them well. Well, first of all, you talk to them. They're undocumented too. They're making $9 an hour, which actually is pretty good in comparison to a lot of other farm workers. No benefits, zero, nothing. And that's the high end of agribusiness in this country in a lot of ways. So that's kind of, well, and then we get to the law. So farm workers are not covered by overtime pay. The law allows children to be hired at younger ages in agriculture than other occupations. And the law allows children to be employed at age 16 to perform hazardous tasks when, if that same hazardous task, like climbing on a large ladder or something else, occurs in a different industry, it's age 18. There's a regulation under OSHA that says that there have to be toilets and drinking water and hand washing water in the fields. But that only applies to farms that employ 11 or more farm workers. So if you work for a small law firm or a small not-for-profit group that has, say, 9 people in it, or 4 people in it, let's say, you expect to have a bathroom. But if you're a farm worker and it's the same size firm, no, you're not entitled to that. I will say California's passed a bunch of good protections. You do get a bathroom in California. In fact, in California, you even get shade protection when it's really hot out, so that you don't die of heat stroke. There are all sorts of other exemptions for farm workers under the law that make it so that they don't even have the legal protection. But even in California, these laws are not being enforced adequately. They're not being enforced by the federal government. When it comes to pesticides, farm workers get the first dose of pesticides in the fields. And very often these are very highly toxic pesticides. Many pesticides actually degrade quite quickly. And so by the time, if you wait 24, 48 hours or a little longer, very often they do degrade and they're much less harmful. And by the time they get to the consumer, in some cases, it's pretty safe. The food is pretty safe. But for farm workers, they're going in there when it's still full strength. And they don't have, OSHA doesn't cover farm workers and pesticides. The EPA has a worker protection standard for pesticides and farm workers, but the EPA is not a worker safety entity. So, the remedies available to farm workers are very weak. So things are kind of pretty dire for farm workers right now in this country. A lot of people will tell you that until there's immigration reform, it will be very difficult to make major strides. Our organization believes that the only thing that has ever really worked for farm workers is organizing. If they can organize themselves effectively, they can make demands on their employers, and then the political power and the laws change. The laws in California changed when Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union organized hundreds of thousands of farm workers. They then, after they were organized, then they won the collective bargaining law in 1975, 10 years after they started their organizing, or a little bit more really. And then they changed health and safety laws, minimum wage laws, and other things. So that's what needs to happen. And when we come to the food safety issue, farm workers need to be included in the efforts that the food safety folks and all of you others who are working on it will be engaged in. As far as I haven't looked in great detail at this food safety law, but as best I can tell, once again, farm workers have basically been left out. I guess we'll take some blame. We didn't really work on the food safety bill. It appears that for the most part, farms are really not covered, which I find shocking in the last week. I know I shouldn't be shocked at anything when it comes to farm workers, and I'm really not. But when it comes to food safety, I would have thought that the safety protections go back to the farm. Now, apparently there are some protections that apply to the packing of produce. And now some farm workers actually pack produce in the fields. They're bending over these boxes, picking the crops, bending over, putting them in the boxes, and they then put them onto conveyor belts. Not a huge percentage, but still. So maybe some farm workers are covered in the fields on farms because they may pack in the field. There also appears to be some ability of FDA and maybe USDA to go back after the salmonella poisoning hits and people are dying. They can go back to the farm and try to get some records to see, well, what happened. And so at that point in time, maybe there's a way for farm workers to kind of sort of help out. I mean, they're the ones who produced the food. I just want to finish up by saying that a lot of people will say, we have to have these farm workers here, but we really can't improve their wages and working conditions because we'd be paying $3 for a head of lettuce if farm workers got a wage increase and the food was produced in the United States. And so a lot of people say, either you have a choice. You can pay farm workers really low wages and allow the cheating to go on, not pay them any benefits, or you can pay them a higher wage, but the produce will all go abroad. We won't produce any fruits and vegetables in this country. And that just isn't true. There are studies that show that you could raise farm workers' wages by about 40%. Now, I know all of you average about $100,000 a year here. You could get the equivalent is you'd get a $40,000 a year wage increase. And what would, if farm workers got that, okay, you might give them $4,000 a year off a $10,000 a year salary. But what would that do to your the cost of fruits and vegetables? Raise it by 2 to 3%. And what does that amount to over the course of the year? Because it turns out, despite the fact that we're all incredibly healthy and thin and eating lots of fruits and vegetables these days, we only spend a few $100s a year on fruits and vegetables. So the cost to you would go up by like $92 in the entire year. So we can have a safe, healthy fruit and vegetable industry in which farm workers are paid decently and treated well. And we're looking forward to taking advantage of this crummy food protection law vis-a-vis farm workers. We're happy about it for food safety, by working with you all to build greater and greater more expansive coalitions and work together to improve things for farm workers as well as consumers. We'll also be working, like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers is already doing, with food corporations and saying it's in your interest to improve conditions for farm workers in the fields, because people want to know that when they go to your supermarket to buy your food, fruits and vegetables, it's not that it's just safe, it's that the farm workers who produced it were treated well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for a very, very eye-opening presentation. Our last panelist of the day is Miranda Nelson from UFCW. And after Miranda, we'll have time for just a few questions, so please feel free to either go up to the mics, or we're also online at hashtag #FoodInTag. So we're also taking online questions.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks so much for you all sticking around, and I'm pretty excited to share some of my research with you all. Can you hear me okay? Is this in a good place? Okay. So I work for the United Food and Commercial Workers, and we represent 1.2 million members, and they're in mostly the food processing and food retail parts of the food chain. Mateo's food pyramid from earlier today, we're on the second and fourth rungs there. Most of our members in food processing are actually in meat and poultry, which raises once again the point that those members were not included in the new Food Safety Modernization Act, and that can have real consequences. And those consequences are what I want us to talk about today. In my department, we spend a lot of time hearing anecdotal stories about ways that our members have improved food safety. Stories like Tony shared with a member, telling an inspector when they saw something wrong. But we wanted to know if the protections of a unionized workplace could really translate into clear food safety outcomes for consumers. And so we decided we had a database that we'd already made of the 450 largest meat and poultry plants. We knew whether or not how big they were, and we knew whether or not they were union. And so we compared this database to the food recalls over the last 10 years in these plants to see whether there are more recalls coming from union or non-union plants. And we found that sure enough, so food products were recalled from 21% of the non-union plants over that time, but only 12% of the union plants. So they were recalled at a much higher rate from non-union plants. We decided to also break this down by type of plant. We looked at pork plants, poultry plants, beef plants, and further processing plants. And we found that pattern held true across the types of plants as well, with food being recalled much more from the non-union plants. And that pattern also held true by the size of plants. So it's true that we were looking at the largest plants in the country, but there are more recalls both at the plants with 250 workers and at the plants with 1,000 workers. So it couldn't just be an effect of of size. That this is held true in various cases. In addition, we found that the severity of recall mattered. So class 1 recalls, which are the most risky recalls, happened at 16.2% of the non-union plants, but only 8% of the union plants. And then 45% of the recalls from the non-union plants involved products possibly contaminated with E. coli, salmonella, listeria, and botulism, while only 23% of the recalls from the union plants involved such contaminants. And within that, 23% of the recalls from non-unionized plants involved E. coli, while only 13% of the recalls from union plants involved E. coli. We were also curious to see if these effects held true across companies, so if maybe one company just had better practices than another. But it turned out that wasn't true, that even within companies, that the non-union plants experienced more recalls over this time period. So I wanted to point out that some of this can be an effect of many more employment protections for workers in unions, that it's harder to fire a worker in a union. They have that kind of whistleblower protections we've been talking about. It's possible that these effects come from other things as well. Union plants might experience lower turnover than non-union plants, so because the pay and benefits are better, so people aren't leaving as often. And so that means you have a better trained, more experienced set of workers who's more likely to recognize problems. In addition, unionized workers can, to some extent, negotiate with management over equipment and staffing. Our union employs industrial engineers who, when they're called, can go into the plants and make sure that there's enough people on the line to do a certain job. And then union plants might have more of a general culture of safety. We have health and safety experts in our union who train workers, and so that kind of care might translate also to food safety. And then finally, union workers can negotiate to have more time off, so you don't have sick and tired workers as much coming into plants doing a certain job. So we think that the whistleblower protections and getting more whistleblower protections are clearly really important, but there might also be other things that unions provide that can end up with really helpful results for the consumer. So I just wanted to end by calling for further research on this. We looked before we embarked on this to see if other people had done this kind of work already that we could point to, and we didn't find a whole lot. And we've also been talking to the USDA and are trying to get them to pick up the ball and do some of this work. But it would be very helpful if other people in the room wanted to take a look at this kind of data as well. And then finally, just to point out that for all the non-union workers, that the whistleblower protections are still really needed for food safety, and so getting the kinds of language we got for the FDA for workers in plants covered by the USDA is also really important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wanted to start out the Q&A session just by, we've had a common thread in this panel and really in the conference as a whole of beyond simply legislation, there needs to be a culture of respect for whistleblowers, and in some cases there's a lack of just basic human respect for workers. So just to the panel, and you've touched on this in various degrees, what are the things we could do, whether it's in our role as consumers or advocates or employees or employers, to really foster that culture where workers can come forward?
Well, I think in this may be the law that sort of serves as a basis to start educating people in terms of their rights and responsibilities. And as I said in my remarks, I think it's going to be important for the FDA to make this a priority as they implement. You know, they're going to have a lot to implement under this law in terms of the new food safety standards, but this has to be an important element as well. You know, you had speakers earlier today. I wasn't here, but I heard that panel was just fantastic of company whistleblowers who were completely ignored, who were punished for coming forward. We have an opportunity here with the provision in the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act to set a standard, and to for the agency, for the government to say that this is going to be a priority of theirs, that they're not going to sit idly by if they hear somebody coming forward with a complaint that has public health implications.
I would just add that as voters, right now, a huge budget process is in play right now. And we've been looking at what would happen at the FDA, and the FDA was supposed to get more funds in the Obama budget that was never approved for fiscal year 2011. It was supposed to get about a little under $150 million because it's getting all these new responsibilities for food safety. But what has been proposed, and it will be even more draconian because all we've seen is stage 1 of the budget cuts, what has been proposed for this year is that increase goes away, and then an additional decrease of about $74 million is enacted. And that's the good scenario. That's not what the extreme majority in the House wants to do. So I think as voters, we need to ask that agencies who keep our food safe have the resources to enforce the law. And you know, that's not going to solve all the problems, but at least it's a start, and it's important, and it's one thing we can do. And I know as a Trader Joe's consumer now, I'm going to really ask them why they aren't doing more to further the rights of the people who produce the food that they sell in those stores. And I think that that's very important, what we can do as consumers.
Good for you.
Oh, absolutely.
I guess I would just add, in addition to pressuring consumers and being good voters, you know, to support the organizations that are doing this kind of advocacy to try and get the agencies to enforce the law and respect workers. You know, for many years, the Department of Agriculture has basically been a wholly owned subsidiary of agribusiness, and we basically saw no point walking in the door. And this administration, to its credit, actually has a different kind of Secretary of Agriculture. And so, you know, we've tried to take you know, advantage of that opportunity. But despite the hospitality that we've received, it takes a lot more to bring about change. And but you know, I think we can be successful in these agencies. But you know, your support for this kind of advocacy is very important.
Yes.
I just wonder if I could point out an example where maybe not unionization, but organization of workers and food safety come together. I don't know how many people here were here for the previous session of this room where you saw farm workers carrying buckets of tomatoes, and you saw the tomatoes protruding about 4 inches above the top of the bucket. We recently got that practice stopped, and that was an immediate 9% paid wage increase for workers, because they were actually picking 11 buckets and getting paid for 10. And so that sounds like labor rights, right? And as soon as we got that changed, we got the growers to agree that a full bucket meant a full bucket, fill it to the top, and you go home. They said, oh yeah, that's way better for food safety, because every time we force the workers to round the buckets, you often have to carry a bucket about 100 yards to get to the truck.